What's up, King of Kings Online? I'm glad you're with us today. Hey, feel free to let us know where you're watching from in the live chat. And hey, it is not too late to invite a friend. So come on, do it like right now. Because we just started a collection of talks called A Quest for Life at Its Best last week. We all want to live a fulfilling life, and Jesus wants this for us too. In John 10:10, he says that he came to give us this full and abundant life. Sadly, however, many aren't experiencing or feeling like they're living a full and abundant life. Emptiness, burnout, exhaustion, worry, and anxiety are words we hear far more today than abundant, happy, joyful, and fulfilled. Why is that? That's what we're exploring. That's our quest. Here's an acronym we're using for this series. It's IPATH. And so last week we talked about invitation and how God invites us into this life. The quest for the best life begins with that invitation from God. And good news, he doesn't withhold this invitation from anyone. We are called and invited into living for something bigger, namely bringing his kingdom into this world. The question we left with last week then is, will you step into the invitation that God has so graciously given to you? God's already done everything for you, like he's invited you. So do you really want God in your life? And ultimately, do you want to play a role in bringing God's kingdom into this world? If the answer is no, you will never experience life at its best. Never. Like you'll constantly be at odds in this world. This life won't make sense. It can't make sense if you, a created thing, aren't connected to your creator. But if the answer is yes, or like if you're unsure or curious or wrestling with God's invitation over your life, hey, let's keep exploring and go deeper. Most of us think, well, if God has invited me into a certain type of life, then I'll see changes overnight. Like I'll experience that fulfillment and that happiness right away, and everything's going to make sense immediately. But that's not usually the case. We're using the story of the great leader Joshua in the Old Testament. Last week, we read the invitation that God put on his life, namely that he would be the leader of a conquest that would fulfill a 500-year-old promise of God, that the Israelites would finally walk into the promised land. God invited Joshua into this, and over the coming weeks, we're going to explore more of his story to see what happened. We're going to jump back into his story later in the message, but first, I want to explore a really helpful verse from the prophet Habakkuk. It's found in chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end, it will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. This verse is reminding us that God's vision will come to pass. It will surely come. And so God's vision, he will bring his kingdom in full effect. But until it does, it says two things. Write the vision. Write it down. And then it says the vision awaits its time. And if it seems slow, wait for it. So what does it say? Write it down and wait for it. Let me start with write it down. I find it interesting that most businesses, companies, churches, and organizations, like they have a mission statement that they know it's the reason for why they exist. And the statement, it summarizes their reasoning for existence. Yet, when it comes to our own personal lives, very few watching this right now have our own personal mission statement. Last week, we talked about the invitation we're all a part of, the big invitation to bring God's kingdom into this world. Like that's what we all do. Like that's the grand purpose in life. But we are all wired uniquely, and you have different gifts than I do, and we bring about God's kingdom in different ways. You go places that I don't, and I interact with people that you don't. And so let me ask you personally, why do you exist? This is where things are going to start taking shape. Do you know why you exist? Most people don't. What on earth are you here for? So my homework this week, I'm going to give it to you early in the message. And feel free to write it in the chat if you already got it. Or feel free to ask any questions that might come up as you're thinking and wrestling about it. Your homework I want you to wrestle with is that question. What on earth am I here for? And what I want you to do is I want you to craft your own personal mission statement. Right? You know God's overall purpose for you to bring his kingdom into this world. But what's the unique role in which you do that? And by the way, in this series, I want to be crystal clear. Like, I'm not just talking about church work, ministry, pastors. Like, when God invites us into something bigger than ourselves, namely building his kingdom in this world, it extends beyond church ministry. And I believe God is calling disciples of all kinds to be involved in so many different places and platforms. And so these messages, I hope, are as much for the teacher, the stay-at-home mom, and the business leader as they are those in full-time ministry. In fact, the person we're studying, Joshua, he's not a pastor. He's a political leader, a warrior in military. But what is the reason you exist? It's hard to go and especially to finish a quest if we don't know the direction we're going. And so your homework again is to write out what you believe is a personal mission statement for your life. Jesus said in Luke 14:28, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Jesus is saying you need a blueprint, you need a budget, you need a plan. Like, it's cool to have the tower in mind. It's incredible to have God's kingdom in mind, but what role will you play and how will you get there? Write it down. It isn't just God who told us to write this down, by the way. It's also backed up by research. In 2016, a Dominican University professor performed a study and found that those who wrote down their goals were 42% more likely to achieve their goals and dreams. Here's my personal mission statement in case it helps. I exist to challenge people of all ages to become greater followers of Jesus. That's my why. This, by the way, is a big enough mission statement to encompass all of my roles as husband, dad, pastor, author, business owner, and so on. Now, I need to get more specific in each role of what that looks like, but I at least know the overall direction. And so Habakkuk says, after we write it down, we wait for it. But interestingly, Habakkuk doesn't mean like a passive waiting. He says we write it down so we can run and take steps and go for it. And if the vision hasn't happened yet, it's because God is still preparing. For instance, in the story of Joshua, we read Joshua 1 last week. God invited Joshua to now go forth and take over the land that God promised to give the Israelites. But what you didn't see last week is that decades before this specific and clear invitation, is that God had already been working in Joshua for this purpose. Let me show you. In Numbers 27, Moses, the leader of the Israelites prior to Joshua, is led to a mountain and he's kind of peering and looking over the promised land. Verse 15, Moses says to the Lord, may the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, so the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. And so the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority so the whole Israelite community will obey him. At his command, he and the entire community of the Israelites will go out, and at his command, they will come in. Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and had him stand before Eleazar the priest and whole assembly. Then he laid his hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord instructed through Moses. It was years from the time of this commissioning until Joshua 1 happened. And even before what I just read to you, we are first introduced to Joshua in Exodus 17. He's a young boy who's fighting as a warrior. Then, in Numbers 13, he, along with another man, Caleb, are one of two spies that 40 years prior to actually going into the promised land, something we're going to see in a couple of weeks, they were encouraging the Israelites that we can go now because God promised it to us, and we can take the land now. And the entire nation rebelled outside of these two men, and their consequence was ending up having to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And then in those 40 years of wandering, in Exodus 24 and 33, tells us he's serving as Moses' aide, as Moses would go up to the mountain to hear from God. And so here's what I'm saying. Even before the book of Joshua and the taking of the land, before the accomplishment that Joshua the leader is known for, there is a record of a solid 40 plus years of waiting and preparing. That's a long time. So whatever the invitation God specifically has for you, I think for many of us, there's this expectation that if God invites me to something, it should be happening today, like right now. But the most significant accomplishments don't happen overnight. We live in an instant society. We have instant meals and drive-through restaurants and pharmacies. We can deposit checks now by taking a picture of them with our phones. We have same-day delivery options. When I need an answer to a question that's difficult, I can ask Google, Siri, or Alexa and have the answer within seconds. We stream entire seasons of shows on Netflix and Hulu and send out texts and expect texts, or at least text bubbles immediately. Now, don't get me wrong, I love all these advances, and I don't want to go back to the days when they weren't available. But with all of this progress, our cultural expectations have shaped our view of God and how we follow after him, haven't they? Like, we expect him to move and to move fast. I wonder how many promises of God that he has spoken haven't come to fruition because his people have given up too early. God's promises will come true. But oftentimes how God brings about his promises, the timing in which he accomplishes those promises is 100% of the time different than what I would choose. As fast as God could work, 100% of the time he's worked slower than I've wanted him to. Here's what I've noticed about God. He cares less about how fast you get to the finish line and more about who you are when you get to the finish line. Joshua spent more than 40 years preparing for the day when he would lead the Israelites. And it wasn't just Joshua in the Bible that had to wait. Joseph waited 2 decades before his dream came to pass. David, before he became king, was anointed more than 2 decades previously. Elisha, after receiving the invitation to follow Elijah, spent 6 years serving under him before he started performing any miracles. Even Jesus, before his crowning moment came, waited patiently for 30 years and then another 3.5 years as he started his ministry before his crowning moment came. Before their crowning moments, before their larger invitation truly became a reality that they could see with their own eyes, each of these guys, they had something in common. They all had to wait. And in their waiting, what did they do? They went to work by preparing. You see, when we hear the words weight training, we think of like going to the gym and like doing some bench presses and some tricep pull downs. But if I had another sermon title today, it would be weight training, WAIT. That while we wait, we are training, we are preparing, we are getting ready. And so what does this look like? It's different for each of us, but while it's different for us, I'll share with you what I'm going through right now, so maybe it can help you discern your own situation. My wife, Allison, and I, we've written 3 40-day challenge books so far, and each book, it's a lot of work, but at the end of the day, do you know what writing a book is? Here's the secret. It's word count. Every book starts at 0 words, and so like, anything, it's put the reps in, block the time, get words on paper. Once you have them on paper, rework them again and again and again, and eventually it gets to the place where, at least for me, I know it's not perfect, but good enough, let's keep going. The one thing I way oversimplified in what it takes to write a book is the overall vision of the book. The controlling idea, the theme. This is the thing that can't be forced. It can't be time blocked and gridded out. About a year after writing our first book, we had no intention, but God gave us the vision or invitation to write 5 more books each. We know the overall direction. We know the titles. We've got the format down for each of the 5. We know what it takes. And by the way, always feels super overwhelming to say that out loud. But we know it's one step at a time. Our first 3 books, I feel like God gave me the vision for those well in advance. And I feel like the vision was so crystal clear in my head. And once you get the vision, you start writing it down, what we talked about earlier, and it starts coming together and the outline forms, then you just start filling it in. And yet for this 4th book coming, Serving Challenge, like I'm still waiting. We know we're supposed to write it, but we don't have the controlling idea yet. And it's not for lack of trying, like we're waiting on it. And God, I'm gonna go on record to say it again, like I want it yesterday. So what are we doing now? We're not just twiddling our thumbs sitting on the couch. We're preparing, we're reading and researching and praying and highlighting things, taking notes, writing down ideas, checking in with one another. And after all that, we still don't have it. And I'm trusting that when we are called to start writing, which I believe is July, we'll be ready and we'll just start writing and we'll see what happens. Again, that's for us. But what are you doing to prepare for your invitation? If your invitation to bring God's kingdom is to become a mom or a dad, then you date your spouse and you love your spouse and you get close spiritually with your spouse so that when you are blessed with a child, you have the spiritual environment that allows your child to be a warrior for Jesus. If your invitation is to be involved in politics, then you get to know who God is, what his word says so that you know how to act, how to intervene, what legislation to pass. If you're a student and thinking about a career, like go to school, study, get some experience under your belt. If at the end of it, you're like still not sure how to prepare while you wait, I'll share one last important thing I see in the Bible with all of these people who waited. Every single one of them became a servant. Joshua was an aide to Moses. Elisha walked with Elijah and served him for 6 years. David served at the king's disposal. Joseph served a royal official and then became a servant in the prison yard. Jesus was the ultimate servant, obedient even to death on a cross for you and me. This is how Philippians 2:5-11 describes it. Think of yourselves the way Christ Jesus thought of himself. He had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave, becoming human. And having become a human, he stayed human. It was an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death. And the worst kind of death at that, a crucifixion. Because of that obedience, God lifted him high and honored him far beyond anyone or anything ever, so that all created beings in heaven and on earth, even those long ago dead and buried, will bow in worship before this Jesus Christ and call out in praise that he is the master of all, to the glorious honor of God the Father. This is what it's all about. Jesus served us. And when Jesus' moment came, he was ready. He'd been preparing for it since the beginning of time, and he did it not out of obligation, but with joy. We said last week it was for the joy set before him that Jesus endured the cross and scorned its shame. And so as you wait, as you prepare, if you're unsure of what next steps to take, just start serving. And I can't tell you when everything God put in you will come to fruition, but write it down and then prepare. Serve while you wait. For when you wait on God and don't rush things, you will reap a harvest, not for your glory, but for his. You see, God will get the glory and you'll get the fulfillment. That's life at its best. It sounds a little bit like this. The prophet Isaiah said, "They who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." So homework, craft your personal mission statement this week. Write it down. Make sure, like Moses did on that mountain, like you ask and inquire of God for this. And feel free to share it with someone else. And we'll join you back next week in the quest.